Welcome back to another episode of the Diabetes Digital Podcast. We are so excited to have one of our colleagues on, Janice Dada, who is a weight inclusive RD registered dietitian with a private practice in Newport Beach, California. She's an intuitive eating counselor, certified diabetes care and education specialist, and certified eating disorder specialist. She's passionate about simplifying and destigmatizing the nutrition and weight-based discourse around diabetes. And she actually has a new book that came out, Intuitive Eating for Diabetes, the no shame, no blame, non-diet approach to managing your blood sugar. And the funny thing is that in our Slack channel for our team of dietitians, there was one of the dietitians who was like, does anyone know of a book that covers intuitive eating for diabetes? And it was funny because I was like, oh, actually, we just found out about this book that came out that we actually endorsed, and we're going to be interviewing the authors. So our team is super excited about this interview. This is a conversation that we have all of the time about like how to incorporate intuitive eating for a chronic condition like diabetes, and especially for type 1. That's a conversation that comes up a lot on our team. A lot of people find that it's more challenging to incorporate these principles if you have a condition that includes like insulin, for example. And so really excited to talk about all of the nuance when it comes to intuitive eating. In this episode, we're going to talk about how diet culture shows up in diabetes care and how it can make things worse. And Janice has a ton of expertise in this area. She's going to talk about how food fear, rigid nutrition advice, and weight-focused care can lead to disordered eating and make blood sugar management actually harder and not easier. We're also going to talk about ways to recognize how diet culture can show up in care and why shifting away from a shame-based approach is really important, and how it's possible to support your blood sugar while still honoring your relationship with food and your body. So whether you live with diabetes or support folks who do, we hope that this conversation offers validation, clarity, and a more compassionate approach to diabetes. Welcome to the Diabetes Digital Podcast. I'm Wendy.
And I'm Jess, and we're best friends, registered dietitians, and diabetes educators.
Through our telehealth platform, diabetesdigital.co, we offer accessible and personalized virtual nutrition counseling for people with diabetes and prediabetes.
Visit diabetesdigital.co, that's C-O, to book your first appointment. We accept insurance and offer affordable self-pay options. Now, let's get into today's episode.
This podcast is brought to you by Hero Bread. As dietitians, we're always on the hunt for store-bought foods that we can confidently recommend to our patients. But here is the catch. Anything we recommend has to actually taste good. Life is short, and I both live to eat and eat to live. That's when Hero Bread reached out. I'd seen them in stores, but I hadn't picked anything up yet, and they had sent a bunch of products for us to try. Now, my husband and I, we love food, and we were immediately hooked. Hero Bread isn't just tasty, it's functional too. Each serving has 0 to 2 grams of net carbs, no sugar, and 4 to 10 grams of protein depending upon the product. So the Hawaiian rolls, for example, which are new and I love, they have 4 grams of protein per serving. It's perfect for managing blood sugar or adding more protein while eating the bread you love. Their tortillas are a new favorite in my house. My husband and I both love using them to make quesadillas as quick snacks. I'm a big quesadilla girl. I've also been using their bread for sandwiches. I love making a sandwich for lunch because it's easy and it's filling, but I am picky about bread. It has to be the best part. And here's the thing, sometimes breads with health claims tend to be dry and disappointing, but not this one. Hero Bread is moist, chewy, and really, truly satisfying. Their hamburger buns are also perfect for my vegetarian patties, and the extra protein helps me hit my daily protein goals. Now, whether you're looking to manage your blood sugar or you just want to enjoy a delicious bread option with added protein and prebiotic fiber, Hero Bread is a simple and tasty option. Ready to give it a try? Visit hero.co to shop their full lineup and use our special coupon code DD10, that's DD as in Diabetes Digital 10, to get 10% off at checkout. And don't forget, they also offer free shipping for orders over $50. That's hero, HERO.co. Now, on to the episode. Welcome to the podcast, Janice.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yay. So I just want to start off by learning a little bit more about your background, right? So you focus on this intersection of diabetes and intuitive eating. You're a certified intuitive eating counselor. How did you get into this specific focus of your work? Did you always have a focus on intuitive eating?
I mean, certainly the focus on this work came from just my experience with clients and things that they were sharing with me. My observations from, what I would see clinicians that they'd see medical providers and so on sharing with them. I got a lot of experience working with people with diabetes at the very beginning of my career because I did my dietetic internship through the VA and then worked there for a couple years. And there was a large population of people who had diabetes. And so I got a great overview of different types of individuals, different kinds of medications that they would use. And it was certainly a very weight centric, very diet focused approach. There was small amount of time for people to be seen. We'd have classes that were 3 hours long and we'd sort of jam pack all of this complex information in. And I could see that, in many ways, a lot of these approaches weren't really working very well. I could see people sort of shutting down during this long 3 hour class. I could see, my colleagues handing out flyers that said, just eat like this. And it didn't really match what I could see people probably needed with this condition. I was already interested in diabetes because my grandfather had diabetes and my mom had gestational diabetes with me when she was pregnant. And so, I didn't know much about it, of course, when I was younger and my grandfather had the condition. But sort of in looking back and sort of seeing the messages that were communicated about it, it was always of an interesting topic to me. And then when I went into private practice, I became a certified diabetes educator, which is what it was called at the time, and also started doing more training in intuitive eating and would definitely see individuals feel this kind of pull as to, can I still practice intuitive eating principles if I have this condition, whether it was diabetes or another condition. And so, really got me interested in the topic. And I could see that there were no other resources really putting the two together. And so that was really the motivation for writing the book, because I wanted to extend beyond, my client work to the greater community to be able to share, how do you use intuitive eating principles with a condition like diabetes, which is so prevalent and the numbers are expected to grow. And yet we still sort of, kind of give the same message, or in general, the population is giving the same message about how to manage it.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that you see disordered eating or diet culture show up for people that have diabetes?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think diet culture is so entrenched in traditional diabetes care, and the messages that people often receive are boiled down to things like eat less, lose weight, move more, cut carbs, really generic statements that don't have a lot of instruction as to how do you actually do those things and still, maintain your quality of life and also meet your nutrition needs, right? So I also often see a very personal responsibility narrative that comes along with a diabetes diagnosis, which really ignores all of the root causes of diabetes, which includes several factors that are really more of a result of society-wide issues rather than some sort of personal failing. And I talk about these in the book as the root causes of diabetes. So, I describe social determinants of health, sleep patterns, certain medications that people may have taken in the past or be currently taking, exposure to things like endocrine disrupting chemicals, genetic factors, nutrient deficiencies, and then also weight cycling. And weight cycling is this loss and regain of weight that people often have if they've restricted their food or they've dieted for some time. So I think those are really important for people to understand, because otherwise they feel like, wow, what have I done wrong? Why do I have this condition? And that's often the message that they're receiving. So they take that with them.
Yeah, totally. And I'm also wondering about some of the patterns that you see, because I'm sure there are people listening, or even people who have family members with diabetes, where they may think that they're doing the quote right thing. But us as clinicians, we might have a little bit more insight into what might actually be a little bit more of a disordered eating pattern. So, what are some of these patterns you see in clients with diabetes? And also, how might some of these patterns go unrecognized, especially by other more traditional healthcare providers?
Yeah. I mean, I've had several clients who've restricted their intake so intensely that really they have now a clinical eating disorder. And yet, when they see their providers, they're often praised for things like weight loss or their blood sugar numbers, but they're not being asked what they're doing to accomplish this. And so, somebody may be restricting their food intensely in order to accomplish what the provider is then praising them for, which is really just praising eating disorder behaviors. And so this praise that they receive and the accolades they receive, allows them to continue practicing their disordered habits. And then they get stuck feeling like this is the only way. And so, I think it's important to be able to share with people like there is another way. You don't have to, have an eating disorder in order to manage diabetes. That's not a practical approach, of course, right? And then on the flip side, I've also had clients who've approached diabetes management with a very all or nothing mindset. And so where they've seen the recommendations as impossible, so they have kind of given up on their diabetes care. They may not take their meds or they may not check their blood sugar because it's sort of seen as like, what's the point? I can't do it. So I think it's a really dangerous message. And so helping people to find this gray area in the middle where we can sort of do both, right?
Yeah. We see this a lot too with cultural foods. And I'm trying to remember, Jess, do you remember who it was that called? Like, we literally had someone call our customer support line a few weeks ago, and
Oh,
they were like, you guys are not giving good advice to people with diabetes. Like, it was like an angry caller. That was a first. I'm trying to remember what it was. Like, I think it was maybe something about like us recommending rice or something like that. I don't remember.
it was definitely, I think, something to do with rice, where we
Yeah,
were.
I feel like rice is just such a hot topic. People feel so passionate about cutting out rice
Yeah.
and yeah, in like the diabetes space. But we see that a lot, whether it's rice or potatoes or tortillas or root vegetables, plantains. That's something I see a lot in my culture, where people are like, oh, yeah, I definitely can't eat plantains. I have to cut that out. Or literally, my mom just got diagnosed with prediabetes and she was like, since diagnosis, I haven't had any mangoes. Like, and like, we have a mango tree in the backyard. So it's
Oh,
kind of
Yeah.
hard. So, how do you see that play out with people's cultural foods and like the messaging that they're getting around that? Because that's really hard.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I hear all of that as well. And definitely rice is a targeted food.
yeah.
And, it's a food that so many cultures around the world use in various forms. And it's not usually brown rice, although I think that's the message people get when they go to their providers, right? Well, now you can no longer eat white rice or, whatever version of rice your culture consumes. And now I want you to eat brown rice when, really we're looking at like an extra, 3 grams of fiber that may be
Yeah.
contributing some small effect to the blood sugar. But we can actually add in other things to the rice, which will help blood sugar stabilize. And so, it's a very narrow minded approach when we're thinking like, oh, you have to pull that out. And the thing that I think backfires is when somebody then goes to, say, a family gathering or they go to a restaurant and they want to order rice or whatever other carbohydrate based food they want to consume. And then it's what's actually called in the research the what the hell effect, right? Where they're just sort of like, well, I'll just eat all of it now because
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to eat it later. It's going to be taken away again. And that is actually worse for blood sugar than just having it regularly and being able
Right.
to listen to our body cues about how much and when to consume that food. It's definitely can be included. I don't see any reason to exclude any cultural food, whether it's rice or beans or tortillas or challah, right? That they all can be part of it.
Yeah. I'm curious, how do you think about carbs? Because so many people come in and, the messaging is very much diabetes equals no carbs, pre-diabetes, cut out all the carbs. How do you teach your clients about carbs and how to incorporate them if they do have struggles with blood glucose regulation?
Yeah, so I use an additive approach, like I was mentioning, where we'll include carbs as part of the whole plate, right? And so we'll want to include, of course, a protein source and a fat source and something that has fiber. And so those three additions help manage the blood sugar a lot better. And so think that it's helpful for people to understand how to build a balanced plate that will help them with their blood sugar management. And in addition, people have their own personal responses to different kinds of carbohydrates. I have some
Right.
people tell me, like, well, this particular food, I see a bigger blood sugar rise than this other type of carbohydrate food. And so I think that's also very useful for people to just kind of get to know their own body's responses, which also is kind of part of the intuitive process, so that they can maybe know, how much do I need to add to this, or how much do I handle of this food. And then in addition, there's other ways that we can help blood sugar after a meal. In the book, I talk about the concept of exercise snacks, which are sort of these ways of just incorporating small bits of physical movement that use the large muscle groups throughout the day. So that could be before or after a meal, or it could be just interrupting periods of sitting. And it's really something casual, like it could be going for a 10-minute gentle walk, which also could be kind of a nice break during the midst of a workday, right? That can actually make a big difference on blood sugar responses. So I think we have to kind of look at, how does this particular individual respond to different kinds of foods? And then what could we add in that might feel supportive? And then something else that doesn't get talked about that much is the idea of how carbohydrates change when they're refrigerated. And so this kind of starch retrogradation, and that also probably somebody would have to figure out for themselves, how much does this make a difference for me? But for example, refrigerated rice that then is reheated, or potatoes that have been cooked and then cooled and then reheated, that changes how much we actually absorb of the carbohydrate. So that could potentially affect the blood sugar response too.
Yeah, I just did a Instagram post about that. So for people, something to try. There's so many tools, right? Okay,
Hmm.
so I have some scenarios. I'm just coming up with these as you're talking, that I can just hear patients saying.
Hmm.
So one of them is, what if somebody they have diabetes and they just decide that, like, oh, I feel better with no carbs. Like, I tend to just focus on like my protein and my vegetables, and that makes it easier for me to kind of track if someone's on insulin. It kind of helps with, maybe in their mind, with their insulin. Like,
Hmm.
what do you say to that?
I always just encourage curiosity around
Mm,
these new practices, so I would be curious as to what else might be changing. How is your energy level, since carbohydrates are a
mm,
big contributor to our energy? There's also, of course, a lot of micronutrients that come along with a lot of our carbohydrate foods, like namely a lot of the B vitamins and iron. And so I'd be curious, like, where are we going to get those if we're cutting things out? And does it feel like a very all or nothing approach? Is this an individual who has kind of all or nothing tendencies in general? And, I'd also be curious about, well, what do you think about when you go to the next family gathering or party or restaurant? Are you still going to feel good eating that way? And so hopefully, if this is somebody who's continuing to follow with their dietitian, that they can kind of continue to have those curiosities, because a lot of times that feels a lot like how we might feel at the beginning of a diet, or how people describe feeling at the beginning of the diet, right? They're excited, they're
yeah,
all in, there's something kind of that feels good about it. And then at some point, it doesn't feel good anymore. And
yeah,
that's when it can lead to that opposite action, where now we're eating a lot more of that food that was restricted.
yeah. Okay, so what about sugar, like foods with sugar? Because people with diabetes will report that everyone is almost like hyper vigilant for them in a way that sometimes doesn't feel helpful.
Hmm.
And I think that can become internalized as well, right? So there are foods that contain natural sugars but still have sugars. I'm thinking like dried fruit. I have like a bowl of dried fruit on the counter right now, or even things like dessert, cookies, pastries. People will come in and say, "Hey, I can't have these foods." What are your tips for people to be able to incorporate those foods while still being mindful of blood glucose?
Yeah. I mean, I think eating all of those foods is part of our normal like everyday eating, right? Unless we actually don't like sweets or don't like desserts, and I don't know very many people that don't like to have some sort of dessert, it's probably not very practical for us to think we're never going to have those again. And I referred to that a little bit as in the book as like the diabetes police, especially when it's coming as sort of this like from other people, like, oh no, you can't have cookies because of your diabetes, or even our own internalized diabetes police. And so I think certainly as part of a meal can be helpful. So, having dessert like along with the food that has the protein and the fiber and the fat can help to slow down the blood sugar. Some people will use that as part of their carbohydrate portion of their meal. Could also, think about, what do I add if I'm going to have like a cookie or something? Do I add a glass of whole milk or something to it? Because now I have fat and protein coming along with the cookie that could help the blood sugar response. So definitely the additive approach is kind of how I would approach the sweets and sugars as well. And when it comes to like non-nutritive sweeteners, I think that can also be a personal preference. I think I like people to just understand that it doesn't have to be something that's used. And if they don't like the taste of, say something like Splenda or monk fruit or whatever the sweetener of choice is, that they can use regular sugar. It's just sort of like, how does that impact the rest of my management? It's not a rule.
And by the way, for people who are wondering about non-nutritive sweeteners or artificial sweeteners, we do have a whole episode about those with a wonderful dietitian, Maya Feller. So we'll include that in the show notes if you want to check it out.
Yeah. Along the lines of scenario questions, something that I see all the time too is for people using injectable, well, not even injectables, but insulin specifically, more so for type 1, but also for type 2. They say that it's really hard to wrap their head around intuitive eating because they have to time everything with their insulin regimen. Sometimes they question us as dietitians, like, is this even possible? It's really hard. I feel like I have to have such a strict regimen, or I might go too low, or I might go too high. So what are some ways, like, first of all, is it possible to incorporate intuitive eating with type 1? And what are some ways to do that, if so?
Yeah, it definitely is possible to incorporate with type 1. I do discuss a couple different case examples in the book. One is actually somebody with type 2 who's on insulin, and sort of when he was first diagnosed, being given a prescriptive limited amount of carbohydrates to consume, and then told, sort of like, give yourself this much insulin and eat this many carbs, which is not a very intuitive way to eat, right? That we're sort of thinking, this is the amount that I only can have. And so I actually was able to work with his practitioner to give him a carb to insulin ratio that then he could use so that he could eat the amount that he wanted to consume and then give the appropriate amount of insulin for that amount of food. And so I think the intuitive question here is, well, I may not know initially how much I'm going to consume, and so then how do I give the insulin for it? And so I think there's a few different ways to go about this, and it really probably depends on the way that somebody's using insulin, whether it's through a pump or it's through their own syringe needle injection, or if they are using a loop system, right? That there's so many different ways that people will give themselves insulin now. You can sort of give it in phased doses. So we could give an amount and then give a correction, or we could sort of estimate how much we think we're going to have, or give it halfway through. So sort of depending on the combination of food ingredients that are in that. So let's say it's actually has a lot of fat and protein and fiber. Would it be okay to give it a little bit later, because we know that the rise of the blood sugar is actually going to come a little bit later, right? So that we could kind of match that rise with the insulin. And then also depending on what type of insulin, if it's a rapid acting, short acting. And so I think that's something really helpful to work with an individual diabetes educator on, so that it can be personalized. Because I definitely think that insulin management in combination with carbohydrates is something that is complicated and does need to be personalized.
Agreed. So let's talk about just some of the long-term consequences, both mentally and physically, for people who have diabetes but are really stuck in diet culture or disordered eating and thinking that they're doing the best thing for their diagnosis?
Well, so the restriction, right, is definitely a long term, can lead to many long term consequences. So, whether it's like a nutrient deficiency because of what's being restricted or overall fatigue, the weight cycling, I think, is a really big one because we know that restriction or dieting can lead to this kind of yo yoing with body weight, the poor mental health outcomes. And then, I think I've often seen people socially isolate, maybe saying no to lunch invitations or saying no to outings that involve food. And, that certainly leads to like decreased quality of life. Being stuck in diet culture really limits what we're going to do, who we're going to engage with, not only with our food, but sort of extending far beyond that.
So, as dietitians, a lot of the research that we see with diabetes and even prediabetes, it's always tied to weight loss. That's hard because I think that we also get questioned when it comes to like intuitive eating and diabetes. Like, well, a lot of the research that I have seen is promoting weight loss as being helpful for diabetes. And so I would love to hear about any research that you've come across that looks at intuitive eating within the context of diabetes and how it might be helpful, because I know that compared to the research that is tied with weight loss, it's not as abundant. So, what have you come across?
Yeah, luckily, there are several studies that have used an intuitive eating framework to look at blood sugar management for both people with diabetes, people with gestational diabetes. And then, just intuitive eating research on its own has over 200 studies. Of course, there's fewer that look at specifically intuitive eating and diabetes, but hopefully in the future we'll get more. But several studies have found that the use of an intuitive eating framework can be a valuable tool for blood sugar improvement because it's been associated with weight stability, which is critical given kind of what I've shared briefly about the harms of weight cycling. And then, in addition, there was a study published in 2021 that found that regardless of BMI, intuitive eating was associated with an 89% lower chance of having poor glycemic control in people with diabetes who weren't using insulin. In addition, another study found that there was an association with intuitive eating and increased body satisfaction in people with type 2 diabetes. And other studies have found that intuitive eating leads to or is associated with lower triglycerides, lower blood pressure, less body dissatisfaction, and less disordered eating. Plus, they found better HDL, that good cholesterol, greater food variety, and then more pleasure from eating. And then the studies that have looked at the effects of intuitive eating on gestational diabetes have all been positive. They have found that intuitive eaters had better fasting blood sugar and A1C 1 year postpartum. So I think all of it is really positive and just need more research to kind of connect the two. But everything we've seen that I've read so far has been really supportive of the approach as a management tool.
I love all that. Thank you for sharing. One thing that you also kind of touch on in your book is just this idea of dismissal or judgment in the medical settings, especially for people in larger bodies, BIPOC communities, or those navigating multiple identities. What advice do you have for people who are trying to advocate for themselves in a weight centric healthcare system?
Yeah, such a challenge. And I do include a resource as part of the book resources that is a letter that can be used with a healthcare provider. I think really self advocacy is something that I often hear clients really struggling with as they're approaching their medical appointments, figuring out how do I really get my needs met from this visit. And so it's certainly challenging to advocate for our needs, and especially in marginalized communities and identities. What I think is helpful is maybe to practice, to outline what is it that I want to be accomplished in this appointment. I love Regan Chastain's work around this topic because she really encourages people to ask very frank questions, such as, what advice would you give someone in a thin body with this problem? And in addition, she also outlines, like from the get go, that you could sort of just start out the visit with, here's what I'd like to focus on in our limited amount of time together, knowing that most visits are like 15 minutes or less with a medical doctor. So, if you're going in and getting a big lecture on something that you really don't is not the focus, that's such a waste of time and copays and everything, right? And in addition, there are a couple lists that have been put together that include names of inclusive providers, or at least names of that people have shared where they have not had a negative experience, which can be helpful for people. I think it's harder in areas where there aren't as many clinicians to choose from, right? And so in that case, that's where we really want to start sort of think about how will I advocate for my needs here.
Yeah.
And if for listeners who want resources on that, we do have a list of weight inclusive providers in different states. So you can always email us and we can try to guide you in the right direction. For someone who's listening and they've been recently diagnosed with diabetes, or they've had diabetes for a while and they really struggle with practicing intuitive eating, they have a history of disorder eating or dieting, what are some good starting points for them? Maybe things that they can take into consideration, questions to ask themselves, or things that they can actually do to move away from restrictive dieting and move towards intuitive eating.
Well, so I think that a starting point is to really identify like what types of practices or rules am I holding on to, and how is that aligning with where I'd like to go? So, sort of like a values assessment. So, if I would like to have a better relationship with food in my body, and I'm restricting these foods, or I'm talking to myself in this way, how is that helping me to kind of align with this goal that I have? The intuitive eating principles outline 10 different 10 different principles that we can use to become more intuitive with our eating. And at the beginning of it is really rejecting diet culture, or rejecting the diet mentality. And so that is a place that we could start. We don't have to start there. We could also start with thinking about, like, how do I bring in some elements that make me feel good? That could be thinking about, like, what ways can I care for myself in a better way, which could be sort of setting up guideposts, such as, things that we could do to encourage regular eating, regular hydration, and other ways that we can kind of add in some self-care and some self-compassion. Which a self-compassionate statement that we could use with ourselves could be as simple as, just reminding ourselves that other people struggle with this too. Sometimes I think many people feel like I must be the only one, or how come I can't figure this out? And so really kind of starting with that in mind, or just the way that we're speaking to each other, can be a good approach. I also like to use the intuitive eating assessment that a researcher named Tracy Tilka has created. It's in its third version now. And that can also give people an idea of where am I kind of struggling with intuitive eating principles. And that can kind of highlight where would I start. So it may be attunement disruptors, like what am I doing that's getting in the way of me being able to hear the messages from my body? Or it may be ways that we can think about enhancing our attunement. So that kind of leads us to which of those principles may be a helpful starting place when it feels like a little bit overwhelming to think about all of them at once.
Your book. We are so excited about it because, as we've mentioned, there is a lack of resources, and diabetes tends to be very diet centric. So there's a lack of like intuitive eating resources. So, can you give listeners a bit of a sneak peek of what they can expect from your book, Intuitive Eating for Diabetes, where they can get it, all the things?
So the book includes 9 chapters. So we start out with an explanation of diabetes, but it may be an explanation that people haven't received before. So in addition to talking about the different types of diabetes, I also go into the root causes that we briefly discussed today. Then from there, we go into the 4 pillars of intuitive eating for diabetes, which includes establishing a diet-free mindset, self-care, gentle nutrition, and an individualized treatment plan. And so there are intuitive eating principles kind of weaved into each of those 4 pillars. And then from there, I have a chapter that covers self advocacy, which we also briefly touched upon, how somebody can do diabetes care their own way, and a chapter on body image. And then lastly, there's a chapter all about intuitive eating for diabetes in the real world, where I have 3 of my former clients who have been willing to allow their stories to be shared. And so they talk about how they used intuitive eating to manage their diabetes. And so it's somebody with type 2 who uses insulin, there's somebody with type 1, and then there's somebody with type 2. So it's kind of a little array of different experiences and how it was helpful for them.
Amazing. For listeners who want to learn more about your work, do you have a website if they want to work with you? I don't know if you're taking on clients, but where can they learn more about you?
Yeah. So there's a book website and I have my private practice website. So the website for the book where you can learn more about the book and have links to where you can order it is intuitiveeatingfordiabetes.com. My website is also linked through that, which is socalnw.com. And that's my private practice, SoCal Nutrition and Wellness.
Oh, cool. Okay. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Janice. This was a excellent conversation. I know our listeners are going to love it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you're interested in nutrition counseling with one of our expert dietitians to help improve your prediabetes or diabetes, visit us at diabetesdigital.co.
Also, if you found our conversation helpful, do us a favor and rate and review this podcast on iTunes, plus share with someone who might find this helpful. You can also connect with us on Instagram at diabetesdigital.co.
And tune in every Wednesday for practical, inclusive, and culturally humble diabetes insights. We'll catch you later. Bye.